welcome back everybody to our second session on multimodal generative AI with Leon Furs. Before we start, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways of Greater Melbourne, the people of the Kulin Nation, and recognise that ACME is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. We also acknowledge First Nations people as the original storytellers of this land and recognise their significant contribution to the moving image. I would also like to acknowledge First Nations people joining us today on the webinar. I'm Zoe. I'm a producer of school programs here at ACME. I would just like to, before I hand over to Leon, just remind you that you're welcome to add questions into the chat today, and we'll leave some time at the end for Leon to answer them. So I'd like to welcome back our AI expert, Leon Furs. Welcome, Leon.
Thank you very much, Zoe, and thank you for inviting me back for this second session. If you are joining us and watching on the recording, or if you're joining us live tonight, just extend Zoe's welcome to you, and thank you for joining us. In this session, we're going to look at creating videos with generative art on the edge of where these technologies are at right now. Many of you will have experimented with text generation, things like ChatGPT. You may have experimented with image generation. Video generation is really the next frontier of all of those, and an extension of what we've seen already with image generators. So I'd like to begin today with an acknowledgement of country as well, and acknowledge the Gunditjik Mara people as the traditional custodians of the land that I'm presenting from today, and extend that to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders people here with us today. I've introduced myself in the first session, so I won't labour the point, but I think the most important thing here is that I spent 15 years in secondary education, and a lot of that time was spent as a media teacher as well as an English teacher. So I'll lean a little bit on my media teaching experience when I'm working with video and audio in these technologies, because I think that there's some really interesting potential there for these technologies to lower the barriers to entry for students learning to use these kinds of platforms. If you're like me and you've taught media in the past, or you've done any kind of video creation in your subject areas, you'll know that there's a tremendously steep learning curve to many of these technologies. And that means we can spend weeks and weeks teaching students how to use a tool, something like Adobe Premiere Pro, perhaps, or even a simpler tool like Apple's iMovie. And the outcome that we get at the end is sometimes a little bit frustrating for the students. We might feel that the students haven't really reached the full potential of what they can create. So one thing that I'm really hopeful for as a former media teacher is that these technologies can be used in ways which support those kinds of activities in the classroom. So in this session, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ethics of video and audio generation, just in keeping with all of our previous sessions, which have had an ethical focus. But then I'm going to dive straight into the practical side of things, look in a little bit more detail into audio generation, and explore some of the platforms that I just touched on briefly in that first session. And then look at things like video generation, avatar generation, and also take a look at the most powerful platform that we have so far. Even though it's one that we can't currently access, it is very soon going to be a very influential video platform. As Zoe mentioned at the start, if there are any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat as we go along, and we'll save a little bit of time at the end for any questions. If you're watching this on the recording and you have questions, then feel free to hunt me down on LinkedIn or find my website and send me questions that way. Always happy to answer questions. So first of all, the ethical concerns. And I think that it's worth dealing with these upfront, because these models are inherently a bit of an ethical nightmare. If you have seen any of our other sessions, whether they were the sessions from last year or the previous session, and the recordings of all of those will be available, you'll have seen me talk about AI ethics in the past and focus on things like bias and discrimination in data sets and in algorithms. This time around, I'm more concerned with copyright and intellectual property concerns because these technologies have been built on a large data set of unlicensed content. And in some cases, that includes content which would ordinarily fall under copyright law. And unfortunately, that means that the people who've created these artworks or music or songs, videos, and all of that content haven't been compensated in any way by the developers of these platforms. The way that they're getting around that at the moment is by using fair use for training purposes laws. So there are laws and regulations in many countries that allow for the use of data that's been collected from the internet in training algorithms, in training AI systems, and for research purposes. But at the moment, there's a lot of friction in courtrooms across the world between artists, creators, and the technology developers, because it really is looking like this is not fair use. If we take a platform like Midjourney, which is an image generation platform, for example, it's very easy in Midjourney to create images which are almost identical to images that you could find in the data set. So, for example, if you were to describe scenes from a Marvel action film, one of the Captain America or one of those Avengers movies, then you can easily recreate in Midjourney an image generated which looks very, very similar, if not almost identical to one of the scenes from that film out of the data set, and that creators of those materials haven't been compensated. The same applies to text generation, audio generation, video generation, and all of the platforms that we're talking about in this series. The developers have indiscriminately scraped sources from the internet, and that includes people's intellectual property, and they haven't made any attempts to make up for that. So what's happening at the moment is that there's a lot of lawsuits, and companies like the New York Times are suing other developers like OpenAI. Just in the last 48 hours, there have been about 3 new lawsuits leveled against companies like Google from artists talking about their images being used for image generation. Aside from all of that and that friction, which will work its way through the courts over the next couple of years, there are also longer term workforce implications. We're already seeing AI content being used to supplant particularly entry-level work in various industries. So as an example, in some Chinese video games development companies recently, huge numbers of artists have been laid off, and the artwork for the background in the scenes and some of the level design is being generated by AI. And then some of those artists that have been fired are being rehired to edit the AI generated content. And obviously, at that point, they're being rehired on a much lower wage because the work is less strenuous than creating the art from scratch. So we're going to see implications like that all over the world. In the US, SAG-AFTRA, the Writers Guild, and others have protested against this. They've gone on strike. The last point on the slide here, really about the gig economy, is that we have already seen in the last 5 to 10 years a huge increase in gig workers. So people who are working for platforms, whether that's Uber or they're making money via platforms like Fiverr and Upwork. And this is really prevalent already in things like web design, software design, and graphic design. So you can go onto Fiverr, you can go onto Upwork, you can hire a contract worker, often for a lot cheaper than you would find somebody locally to do that work. And the implication of that is that AI is going to accelerate that economy, because now everybody has these AI tools at hand. People can theoretically create that kind of content incredibly quickly, but there's going to be a bit of a race to the bottom in terms of how people are churning out this kind of work. So there are some real workforce implications, there are some implications, economical implications, and there are, of course, copyright and intellectual property implications. Whilst all that's going on in the background, people are already using these tools. So one thing that I always try to balance out is the ethical conversation with the practical and the pragmatic side of things. And that's really important because the students that we have in the classrooms in front of us are also experiencing these technologies. And often the technology will outpace the regulation. So we're going to see this stuff come into our classrooms, often whether we like it or not, and also in some cases, whether it's been fully regulated or not. So we need to learn how to deal with those technologies. I'll begin by talking about audio generation, and I'm talking about sound effects, music, and voice. So I gave a little bit of a sneak preview of some of these technologies in the first session, but I'm just going to play a few examples to show you a little bit more about what these look like. So first of all is Stable Audio. Stable Audio is a platform from the AI developer Stability AI, who have also made one of the most popular open source image models, Stable Diffusion. And this model works on a data set of licensable open access music. So stock royalty-free music, which has been licensed fairly. That means that, you know, you could potentially use this for commercial purposes. Students could use it as part of their education practices. And there's none of those copyright or intellectual property issues with this particular platform. You can see on the vibe the kind of music that you want, ambient, electronic, chill background music, and then it will generate a soundtrack on the free version up to about 3 minutes long. And here's an example of what one of those tracks sounds like for some ambient, chill background music. So as you can see, that's not particularly impressive, and that's probably because it's built on that data set of stock music, which is a small data set, a little tiny data set of licensable music. But just recently, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen two new platforms come out for audio generation. One which is called Udio, and one which is called Suno. And these platforms, we don't really know exactly what's in the data set, but we can pretty much guarantee that the data set contains unlicensed, copyrighted music. The reason that we know that is because people have already gone in and experimented, prompting for things in the style of other artists, and have been able to generate some pretty convincing music in the style of people like Eminem or in the style of ABBA and so on. So Udio, Suno, these are, again, companies that are likely to face some pretty heavy-handed lawsuits in the coming months, but they're also getting millions of dollars of finance from venture capital and tech companies. So the prompt that I've used here is a totally unironic song from a movie soundtrack about how artificial intelligence is problematic when the developers don't respect copyright. So a bit of a mouthful, but I wanted to see what Udio and Suno would come up with these prompts. This first one is a track from Udio, which sounds a little bit like Blade Runner crossed with Enya.
We can write our code into the sky, feel our digital touch, watch our autonomous dreams fly high, pixel dreams. I think we're questioning deeper, don't speed it now.
Okay, that's our attempt from Udio. And the second one is an attempt from Suno, which is a totally different platform, built on the same premise, built on a lot of data. And again, we don't know exactly where this data comes from. And this time, same prompt, It's given a very different interpretation. It's given sort of an upbeat kind of techno song, but again with lyrics, with singing, with all of the things that you would expect from a musical composition.
In a world of algorithms, where lines intertwine, a digit symphony, a future undefined. But behind the code, there's a secret it conceals, unlicensed content, the truth it reveals. Oh, oh,
Okay, so as you can see from those two examples, music generation technology is already at the point where we can feasibly generate real sounding music. Those two examples, they're very brief, not really using a particularly sophisticated prompt. If you go to Udio and Suno yourself, you'll see endless reams and reams of content that's already being generated by people using those platforms. And again, these will definitely make their way into other things that we use already all of the time. So it's probably not very far off that we'll see these things integrated into platforms like Spotify. You'll be able to generate background music or study music or any kind of music really with an almost infinite level of control just using text-based prompts. And that's got some real implications for those industries. This is an example of voice generation or speech synthesis. And in the introductory video to this, this series, I played a little example of my voice. This is an example of one of 11 Labs' synthetic voices. So this is a voice that's totally fabricated, talking over the top of this slide in just a moment.
You could easily use a platform like this to create the voice track for a video, including generated avatars. In fact, platforms like HeyGen can already integrate with 11 Labs.
So 11 Labs can create really convincing human-sounding voices. You might have noticed there, if you were listening carefully, it even makes the little microphone popping sound on the P in platform. So it sounds very much like a kind of podcast presentation, and that's probably because a lot of that data in the data set has those kinds of popping noises on the plosives and other kind of background noise. But with 11 Labs, you can even control that kind of level of detail. You can put in breathing sounds, you can make it more prone to pausing, using crutch words like and like. So there's a really fine level of control over the voices that you can generate in that platform. Moving on from audio generation for a moment, I'm going to look at two video generation platforms. The first is Runway and the second is Sora. Runway is available right now, and you can get in there and use some free credits. I demonstrated it a little bit in the first session. I'm going to dig in a bit more in this one. And Sora is OpenAI's most powerful model, which I'll talk about next. Runway as a platform operates in two basic ways. The easiest way that I've found to use it is to generate a still image and then put a bit of animation into the still image. So what you can see here on the slide are 3 images generated in Adobe's Firefly model, just with some generic prompts like science fiction establishing shot or interior of a science fiction building. And then we take those images and we plug them into Runway. You can put the entire image into Runway and you can use a text-based prompt, or you can control it in a variety of other ways. So what you can see on this slide at the moment is me dropping that image into Runway. And then I'm going to use a text-based prompt. I'll just say something like it's an establishing shot, which will give it a little bit of instruction over what the scene should look like. Then I can actually control the camera motion. So you can see here I'm controlling things like the zoom, where it zooms from and to, a little bit like the Ken Burns effect that you might be familiar with in iMovie. The vertical and horizontal panning, we could do tilts, we could do rolls, all sorts of camera movements that we would commonly find in video editing software. Runway also has a thing called a motion brush. So we can actually select parts of the sky, maybe select the clouds, and just generate a little bit of movement in that one specific area of the scene. And really the way that Runway works is it takes whatever image you drop in there, and then it interpolates and creates a range of images in between. Essentially, a video is just a series of still images stitched together. So that's the way that Runway approaches things. So as you can see there on the slide, we've got a little bit of a slow kind of zoom forwards. So I'll just play that one again. Just zooming forwards through this science fiction corridor, as if you've picked up a camera and moved through that still image. So this is still really early days technology. Runway throws up some really interesting looking videos, but they're definitely not realistic by a long stretch. But there are ways to, use traditional editing software and methods to stitch all of these things together. So if I was to take some of those video files from Runway that I've generated, maybe take some of that audio that I've generated and drop them into a traditional bit of editing software like iMovie, this is probably how I would use these technologies in something like a media classroom. So I would take those 3 video clips. I would take one of my audio files generated in Udio or Suno or maybe something like Stable Audio, drop that in as the audio track, do a little bit of quick, cheap and cheerful editing, and create something which looks like this short video on the next slide.
We can write our code into the sky, feel our digital touch.
So you can see that, this isn't going to win any Oscars, but imagine what this technology is going to look like in 12 months or 18 months time. We saw how fast the development of image generation came upon us. So in under 18 months, if you were in the first session, you will have seen this. If not, check out the recording. But in less than 18 months, we went from AI generation that couldn't do faces, couldn't do hands, that was really problematic in terms of race and gender biases, to image generation, which is quickly becoming photorealistic. So if we take that kind of same scale with video generation, then we're probably pretty close already to some much more believable looking videos. Runway can also be used to generate avatars. Sorry. Runway can also be used to generate avatars. And the way that this works is similar to platforms that you might have heard of, like HeyGen and Synthesia. So just in this little video here, all I'm doing is taking the audio clip that I generated earlier in 11 Labs and putting it against a still image. Just one of the stock ones from Runway's own library. And it will lip sync the audio from the audio file to the still image of my chosen avatar. So I'll just move forward and show what this looks like when it's all stitched together. So if we take our 11 Labs audio that you heard earlier, the totally synthetic voice, and we've now got a totally synthetic picture as well, and it will map out the facial details of that picture and add in a little bit of eye movement and a bit of lip syncing with the audio.
You could easily use a platform like this to create the voice track for a video, including generated avatars. In fact, platforms like HeyGen can already integrate with 11 Labs.
So at the moment, we're in a stage where the technologies are very nascent. They're very kind of new and sort of cutting edge. But we know that there are platforms out there already, like HeyGen and Synthesia, which can be used to create very realistic looking avatars. I've used a generated image in this one, just one of Runway's stock library, but I could have used a photo of myself. I could have theoretically used a photo of anyone else, which is where we start to get into those deepfake territories. And again, we've talked in previous videos about the ethical concerns, and the use of these things to create convincing deepfakes is right up there amongst the highest concerns that we're facing with this industry and these technologies.
You could easily use a platform like this to create the voice track for a video.
So these next few demonstration videos, these come directly from OpenAI. And I'll just set this one playing in the background whilst I'm talking. These videos have been generated by OpenAI to demonstrate their product. So we don't exactly know how much work went into these, but we do know that Sora is a very powerful text to video model. So we know that this has been generated from the Sora model using just a very simple text prompt about an astronaut. We know that this next slide has been generated in a similar fashion using, if you're a Mac user, you might be familiar with the Big Sur background that was on one of the Mac operating system updates for a while there. So this is Big Sur in the US, and they've added some animation to that using, again, just a text prompt. So very believable, much more smooth, much more believable than Runway's output. And this final video is an example of what Sora looks like when it's applied to Pixar-style animation, 3D computer animation. At this stage, the model Sora is not available for public use. And there's various reasons for that. One is that OpenAI have said that they're trying to make sure that it's safe before they roll it out. I imagine that a big part of the reason behind that is because they haven't ironed out their copyright lawsuits just yet. Again, we have absolutely no idea what's in the data set for this very big and capable video generation model, but we can almost guarantee that they've scraped a lot of potentially copyrighted or unlicensed intellectual property into that model. But it's not slowing down the progress of these technologies. And we know that because just recently, Adobe released a little teaser video to say that they're going to be allowing users to integrate with both Runway and Sora in Adobe Premiere Pro. So in an upcoming release of Adobe Premiere Pro, we're going to see plugins for Runway, Sora, and another model called Pika, which have the capacity to do all kinds of things within that kind of video editing realm. So if you create a video in Adobe Premiere Pro, or if you upload a raw video file to Adobe Premiere Pro, let's say you've got a video of somebody walking down the street and you want to extend that video just by 5 or 10 seconds, very soon you'll be able to use Sora to just generate an extra 5 or 10 seconds of somebody walking down that same street. The original video footage never existed. Similarly, you will be able to use Runway and OpenAI's product Sora to generate entirely novel content which never existed in the first place. You will be able to add content to the background of scenes, change scenes in the same way that you would do traditional green screening, and even use generative AI to scrub out or erase things from scenes without having to go through and manually edit every single frame, which is one of the approaches that we might have to take at the moment. So there are some creative potentials for these, hugely impactful in terms of existing software. So Adobe Premiere Pro it's industry standard video editing software, and the fact that they are integrating with OpenAI, with Runway, and with other companies is a big sign of where the industry is heading. That's why I also say that it's very likely that big music sort of applications like Spotify will ultimately integrate some kind of AI audio generation as well. Now, there are obviously really significant implications of all of those technologies. So I want to come back to some of the practical implications and some of the ethical implications just to kind of wrap this section up before I open up and see if there are any questions from the Acme team or anybody else watching. But I mentioned lowering the barrier to entry for complex software. So if Sora and Runway are integrated into Adobe Premiere Pro, that will make a lot of editing processes a lot more straightforward than they are now. We won't need to teach students how to use a combination of tools like After Effects, Adobe Premiere, Adobe Photoshop in combination. For those of you that have taught subjects like media, you'll know that you need all the time in the world to teach those because they have such a steep learning curve. There's also an accessibility benefit, potentially. So there might be students, young people, or people out there in the world who are limited in their abilities to use certain applications because they are so technical, they are so difficult to use, and there are accessibility issues. So there's a potential there for generative AI technologies to make these programs more accessible. Another way that that might come to play is in speech recognition. Speech recognition has improved tremendously since the advent of generative artificial intelligence models. So OpenAI has a model called Whisper, for example, which is significantly better at recognizing speech than traditional voice assistants, things like Siri and Alexa. So the addition of generative AI voice control to software may also make it more accessible. I think there will be completely new tools for creators that emerge from these technologies, things that we probably can't even imagine right now. And the reason that I say that is because that is the trajectory that these kinds of technologies have always followed. It can be really difficult to remember, but the internet hasn't been around forever. I'm old enough to remember when dial-up first emerged and when PCs were first becoming a thing in the late 90s. But prior to that, really, the internet was military applications, and then it emerged with protocols for internet access and email. And people were saying, okay, yeah, this internet thing's pretty cool. I'll go on, I'll surf the web for a little while. But we don't really see any benefit in the internet becoming faster. We're not interested in broadband technologies. We had the dot-com bubble that burst in the 2000s when everybody realized that the hype wasn't really living up to expectations. And then we got a resurgence of new technologies. We started to head towards more of the kind of ecosystem that we have now. So I think we'll see a very similar trajectory with artificial intelligence. We're at the moment, we're in the middle of the kind of hype period. We're probably due in the next 12 to 18 months for a bit of a bubble burst where many AI-powered companies, including ed tech companies, come crashing down. But from that, I think we'll see some really interesting stories emerging and some really interesting applications coming out that use generative AI. The last point in the positive implications is just bringing it home to what we can do right now in the classroom. I would use these technologies for really rapid storyboarding. I would use it for making really quick ideas and prototypes of movies. If I was back in the English classroom, I would use it as part of media creation, maybe creating advertisements, short story narratives, and those kinds of things. In the next and final session this year for Acme, we'll talk about video game generation. We'll talk about what it looks like to create components of video games, like the graphics or the code. But very, very quickly, I think we'll be able to have students creating fully multimodal, very, very fast creations using these technologies. Unfortunately, we have to take the rough with the smooth. We have to acknowledge that those copyright and IP issues exist. We have to do what we can as educators to tell people about these problems. And we also can push back as creators ourselves if we feel that these developers are doing the wrong thing. So there are ways that this is being pushed back against. Stable Audio, the platform that I demonstrated earlier, is owned by Stability AI. One of the former VPs at Stability AI, Ed Newton-Rex, left that organization because he was so unhappy with how they were approaching intellectual property. And he actually started his own company called Fairly Trained, which is offering certification for companies that prove that they've got a fairly trained data set or a fairly trained model that uses licensed data. And there are already dozens of artificial intelligence developers that have achieved that fairly trained license. So you can go to fairlytrained.org and you can check out that license, but you can look at those companies that are already in there. And there are music generation applications, there are text generation applications, image generation, and I'm sure that there will be video, code, and all sorts of generation coming under those licenses too. Another one that I'd point you in the direction of is Dr. Joy Buolamwini and the Algorithmic Justice League, the AJL. They are doing a power of work in the States at the moment on raising awareness around the copyright and intellectual property issues, and also in encouraging creators, artists, authors to engage with artificial intelligence, not to steer away from the technology or kind of stick your heads in the sand, but to actually say, hey, the technology that we have now is flawed. It's fundamentally flawed. It doesn't treat creators with respect, but there is something that we can do about it. And at the end of the day, it comes down to respecting creatives, respecting artists, and respecting their work. That's something that I think that an organization like Acme would certainly get behind. It's something that most educators I know would get behind. And it's certainly something that myself, as an author and somebody who creates a lot of content, I'm really, really passionate about at the moment. So check out Fairly Trained, check out the Algorithmic Justice League, and investigate ways to use these technologies which are appropriate, but which also highlight some of those flaws. Now, you can ignore the next session details on the bottom there because they are actually incorrect, but we will open up now for any Q&A. I might ask if Zoe, if you've got any questions from the Acme team, and we'll see if there's any other questions coming in there too.
We've got a question actually from one of our guests, and that is, have you seen any evidence for how this could impact on the ability to create special effects, i.e. entry-level CGI, without the need for programming and expensive software?
Yeah, absolutely. So this will be, I think, one of the main uses in the short term of technologies like Sora in Premiere Pro. So one thing I would encourage you to do is jump on LinkedIn and find a director whose name is Paul Trillo. That's Trillo. He's been given early access to Sora by OpenAI. Obviously, OpenAI's job is commercial in nature. They want to make money from this product. One way that they're working on that is they've enlisted a lot of artists, directors, music video creators to use Sora and to create things. Paul Trillo's movies and the way that he's using the technology is probably the most interesting. He recently made a post on LinkedIn where he actually gave a full kind of technical run through of how he used traditional technologies, Adobe Premiere Pro and After Effects, and Sora to create CGI visual effects, and actually to do quite a lot of image manipulation to make a short film. So that's a really interesting one to check out.
Fantastic. Just while we're waiting for any other questions to come in, I actually had a bunch of questions for you, Leon, but you've answered all of them, which is awesome. I think just in some of your last points around accessibility is fantastic and it's going to be a game changer. I think also when, and we find this at Acme too, when we're running a program, we have a really limited time to teach a certain amount of craft and to give students a sort of a product that they can take back to school and take home and have sort of completed a mini project, I guess. So I guess some of these resources will help speed up some of that early process. So I guess it's going to be interesting to my question. It's sort of maybe a comment rather than a question, but balancing the teaching of craft and the learning of craft, which needs to come from expertise and a person in the room to make it that really valuable hands-on experience. But also, how do we balance that with, inviting these technologies in to help speed up some of those processes or enhance some of the processes that you may not have the resources to do at school or in the time, and how curriculums will respond to that in terms of output of student work too.
I mean, it's a really important conversation going forwards to look at what kinds of technical skills are fundamental. I think that, you know, there's a narrative at the moment that AI will democratize creativity, and I don't really like that because I think that creativity was already democratic. There's nothing undemocratic standing in the way of creativity. Anybody can learn to create in various ways. You know, I might not be the world's greatest artist, but I can certainly work at it and improve. What AI does do is maybe accelerate certain technical parts of those processes. But I think there's still absolutely a place to teach those fundamental skills. So just because you can make visual effects in using Sora, for example, doesn't mean we should stop teaching students how to use After Effects, Premiere Pro, and other applications to the fullest, because students who can use both of them at a really high level will be producing the best work. It might be easy to produce okay work using just AI. It might be easy to produce okay work using just the bare minimum of knowledge with Premiere Pro. But to get the most out of all of those applications, then you still need to put in the work. You still need to learn those fundamental skills.
I was thinking too about your animation example and how that's sort of speeding up that idea of having to put in the work, say in a stop motion animation or putting in all of those frames. But there's such a joy in learning the process of how to do that painstaking work to then make your craft better. So I can see how the two can sort of work together, but you need that fundamental craft underpinning it.
Yeah, and look, those crafts, I think one thing we might see is we might see a little bit of a situation where people drift towards things that they are more passionate about, even if it's something that AI can technically do. I mean, one of the people that I also follow on LinkedIn, and his name escapes me at the moment, but he's a stop motion animator that's done work for Bluey, for the Lego company, for all kinds of producers, advertising reasons, short stories. He shares a lot of creative videos of how he makes really incredible stop motion animations, very painstaking, a lot of work going into them. But you can just tell that he really enjoys doing it. So I don't think that AI will change that. I think people will still continue to do things that they love, even in some cases, if that means doing it the old-fashioned way or with a blend of technologies.
Yeah, fantastic. There's no other questions coming through, but if you think of anything later, do feel free to get in touch with us at education@acme.net.au, and we'll definitely get those questions answered for you. Please join us for our last session, which is Wednesday, the 15th of May, at the same time, and we will send you a reminder link a day or so before. And that one will be on generative AI and video games. So really looking forward to that. Thanks again, Leon. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and we'll see everyone next time. See you soon.
Thanks, Zoe.